They called her just a nurse, but the hands adjusting Commander Jake Morrison's full lines had placed central lines in bombed-out field hospitals under mortar fire. Dr. Mercer didn't know that. He didn't see the muscle memory encoded in her movements, the economy of motion, the precision, the absolute lack of tremor as she worked. He didn't know about the faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining, the only piece of medical battalion, 2nd Marine Division, she'd kept after her records were scrubbed and her name was erased. What happened next didn't just silence the room, it planted the seeds for everything that followed. Seattle General's ICU hummed with the white noise of machines keeping broken people alive. Ventilators wheezed their mechanical rhythm. Heart monitors beeped in staggered syncopation. The overhead fluorescent lights cast a cold blue-gray wash across everything, turning skin the color of old newspapers. Danielle Ross stood at the bedside of Commander Jake Morrison, patient bed 7, a traumatic brain injury transfer from Denver Presbyterian, 42 years old, Marine Corps, with a Glasgow Coma Scale score of 6 and a prognosis that made every attending physician in the hospital reach for their pens with resignation. She checked his pupils with the precision of someone who'd done this 10,000 times. The beam of her penlight caught in his left eye, dilated, slow to react, and she made a note in the chart without changing her expression. Her scrubs hung loose on a frame too lean for civilian life, and there was a quality to her silence that made other nurses look over and nod. Not friendship. Recognition. The kind you only get from people who've been somewhere most humans never go. The commander's left forearm lay exposed above the blanket. Tattooed in block letters, Ross. Just the one word, no first name, no date, just Ross in Marine Corps black ink that had faded under 13 years of sun and scar tissue. Danielle had seen it the moment they wheeled him in 48 hours ago. She hadn't reacted then either. Down the hallway, in the conference room on the 3rd floor, 20 doctors sat around a table signing a consensus document. 20. The exact number required by hospital protocol to recommend withdrawal of life support based on poor neurological prognosis. 20 neurosurgeons, cardiologists, critical care attendings, and neurologists who had examined the commander's CT scans, reviewed his injury mechanism, calculated his recovery probability, and determined that the ethical path forward was comfort care only. They'd reviewed it as a committee. They'd documented it. They'd moved on to their next patient before the ink dried. Dr. Mercer entered the ICU at 6:02 p.m., designer watch glinting under fluorescent lights like a beacon of superiority. He wore the kind of cologne that announced itself before his body did, expensive, aggressive, the olfactory equivalent of a raised voice. His white coat had been tailored. His stethoscope hung from his neck like a medal, though Danielle had never seen him actually examine a patient with it. He moved through the ICU the way a man moves through a gallery where every painting is supposed to look at him. He paused at the commander's bedside, studying her for the first time with genuine attention. His eyes tracked from her scarred forearms, thin white lines that caught the light like scratches on glass, to her hands, which were steady, precise, already adjusting the ventilator settings with the competence of someone who'd done this in theaters of operation where there was no respiratory team, no backup, no margin for error. Just you and the patient and the knowledge that if you got it wrong, the man under your hands died. Danielle felt him watching. She didn't acknowledge it. She continued her work. The ventilator parameters had been set at 15 breaths per minute with a tidal volume of 650 milliliters, but Dr. Mercer had changed them an hour ago, bumped the rate to 20, reduced the tidal volume to 400, and Danielle had watched him make those adjustments without understanding the reasoning behind them. The settings were aggressive. They served no clinical purpose for a patient with Morrison's injury profile. She'd checked the chart notes. Mercer had written nothing, ordered nothing, explained nothing. Now she reverted the settings with the same casual precision he'd changed them. 15. 650. Her hands moved like they were reading Braille on the machine's plastic face. Dr. Mercer's smile sharpened. He said nothing. He didn't need to. The message was clear: I saw what you did. I saw you second-guess my orders. And I'm keeping track. The commander's sister, Rebecca, arrived at 7:15 p.m., carrying a coffee from the downstairs cafeteria and the kind of exhaustion that comes from sleeping in a hospital chair for 2 nights straight. She was 51, Danielle guessed, though grief ages people in ways that have nothing to do with actual time. Rebecca pulled the visitor's chair close to the bedside and sat down with the deliberate care of someone whose knees were screaming. Danielle was checking me for dressing when Rebecca spoke. "You're really good at that," the sister said. "Not a question. An observation. Maybe gratitude wrapped in simple statement." 8 years, Danielle replied. 10 words. That was her rule for talking to families. Never more than 10. The fewer words, the less room for them to learn who she actually was. Rebecca looked at the commander's left arm, at the tattoo, at the name printed there in ink that had been part of her brother's skin longer than any of them had been in this hospital. "Jake had a friend in the service," Rebecca said. "A woman. He wrote about her in emails. We never knew her last name. Just that she pulled him out of a burning Humvee in 2011 and carried him 3 kilometers under fire." Rebecca paused. "He said he'd never forget her name. He said it kept him alive." Danielle's hands continued their work. The fall was secure. The dressing was clean. There was nothing else to adjust, but she adjusted things anyway, because moving was better than standing still, and standing still meant Rebecca might see her face, and her face wasn't schooled to hide everything yet. Not completely. Not when someone was telling her the exact story of her own ghost. "Where is she now?" Rebecca asked. "This friend." "Dead," Danielle said. "Officially." Rebecca nodded like this made perfect sense. People in this war were dead all the time, physically, officially, spiritually, legally dead in 17 different ways. She reached over and touched the tattoo with her fingertips, the way you'd touch a memorial. He talked about her for years. Then he stopped. I think the Corps told him he had to. I think it was classified. Danielle adjusted the monitor lead running across the commander's chest. The waveform was steady. Sinus rhythm at 84 beats per minute. The graph climbed and fell like a mountain range, beautiful and heartbreaking, still fighting even though 20 doctors had voted to stop. After Rebecca fell asleep in the visitor's chair at 9:42 p.m., Danielle reached under her scrub jacket to the inner lining, where the unit patch was sewn in a careful square of stitches that she'd maintained every 6 months for 6 years. Medical Battalion insignia. 2nd Marine Division. The thread was starting to fray at the corners. She touched it with her index finger, a ritual she performed before every shift, the same way other people touched crucifixes or photographs or lucky coins. It was the only piece of Captain Danielle Ross she'd kept. The only evidence that she'd ever worn the uniform. The only thing connecting her to a name that had been officially dead since 2015. The fluorescent lights buzzed and flickered. Outside the ICU windows, the Seattle rain had started again, the kind that came in October and didn't leave until April, just constant grey water falling on a grey city where nobody asked questions about people who appeared with no history and worked double shifts without complaint. The patch under her fingers was rough from age. The stitches were holding, but barely. She smoothed her jacket back down and returned to the commander's bedside. His sister breathed softly in the chair, her hand resting on the blanket near his feet. The ventilator delivered each breath with mechanical precision. The monitors showed a brain still working despite the consensus of 20 doctors who'd agreed it was time to stop. The tattoo on his arm said Ross, and it was the only thing in this entire hospital that remembered who she used to be. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Dr. Mercer had just set his tablet down on the counter outside the ICU, where a group of residents clustered around the morning's case presentations, and he was already talking, voice pitched loud enough for the entire unit to hear, the kind of volume that announced itself as performance. Some people, he was saying to the residents, mistake stubbornness for competence. They lack the actual medical training to understand the difference between persistence and delusion. That's what happens when you get too comfortable in your role. You start thinking you know better than the physicians. He laughed. A real laugh. Especially when all you've got is a nursing degree and some field experience from a war we're trying to forget. The residents laugh too, because residents laugh when attendings make jokes, because their entire career depends on not making the mistake of having an independent thought. Danielle heard every word from inside the room. She didn't turn around. Her hands continued their work. Her jaw tightened imperceptibly. That was all. That was everything. She was already keeping track too. Dr. Mercer stood at the foot of Commander Morrison's bed like a conductor before an orchestra, his white coat pressed sharp enough to cut glass, his voice pitched to carry across the entire ICU without seeming to raise it at all. The commander's sister sat rigid in the visitor's chair, her knuckles white around the chair arm. Morning rounds. Family conference. This was theater, and Mercer had always been a virtuoso. "I apologize," he said, his tone suggesting he was apologizing for something that should have been obvious weeks ago, that our nursing staff doesn't understand the difference between persistence and delusion. Some people mistake stubbornness for competence when they lack actual medical training. He said it loud enough for the 3 other nurses at the station 30 feet away to hear. Loud enough for the respiratory therapist in the adjacent room. Loud enough for everyone to know exactly who he meant. Danielle stood on the opposite side of the bed, adjusting the fall line with the same steady precision she'd developed over 16 years of field work, 3 tours in Helm and Province, 2 Purple Hearts, a medical license from a community college that had trained more combat nurses than any institution in the country. Her hands did not tremble. Her jaw clenched once, a micro movement like a caught breath, then released. She wrote on the chart without looking up. The commander's sister glanced between the decorated physician and the silent nurse, her doubt spreading across her face like a stain. Mercer had orchestrated this perfectly, the public humiliation, the positioning of authority, the subtle insinuation that affection had clouded Danielle's judgment. He leaned closer to the sister now, his voice dropping to a confessional tone that somehow still carried. "Nurse Ross here seems to think her credentials trump consensus," he continued, gesturing vaguely at Danielle as if she were a malfunctioning monitor. "We call that the Nightingale complex. When caregivers develop emotional attachments that cloud their clinical judgment. It's common in nursing. Very common. They see a patient and their maternal instincts override their critical thinking." Danielle's pen continued moving. Blood pressure. Oxygen saturation. Medication times. The mundane poetry of survival. The sister's hand trembled. "So you're saying there's no hope?" "I'm saying," Mercer said, straightening his coat with the satisfied gesture of a man who had just closed a sale, "that we need to be realistic about outcomes. Your brother's Glasgow Coma Scale score is 6. His imaging shows extensive frontal lobe damage. The data is what it is." He walked away before Danielle could respond, which was the point. He had never wanted a conversation. He wanted capitulation. He wanted the sister to nod. He wanted the nurses to understand that questioning him was career suicide. That afternoon, Danielle carried her lunch tray into the break room, a sad affair of fluorescent lights and a refrigerator that hummed like a wounded animal. She chose an empty table in the corner, the kind of table where people who were being quietly exiled Saturday. She opened her container of rice and grilled chicken, the same thing she'd eaten every shift for the past month because it was efficient and because she couldn't afford to lose her focus on anything frivolous. Maria approached first, her lunch tray balanced on one hand. Chen followed. Then Rodriguez. Then Jackson. The 4 nurses who had been friendly enough to say good morning, who had joked with her about the difficulty of the night shift, who had asked her opinion on difficult patients. They gathered their food without a word. They relocated to the hallway. She could hear them whispering as they left, the syllables too soft to resolve into speech, but the meaning absolute. Danielle chewed methodically. The food had no taste. She was aware of her heart rate, elevated but controlled, the kind of physiological response you learn to manage in places where panic meant death. She focused on the wall directly in front of her, a poster about hand hygiene that no one ever truly looked at, and she kept her breathing even. In through the nose. Hold. Out through the mouth. The way they taught you at selection course. The way you taught yourself when the world decided you didn't exist. She was still finishing her rice when the intercom crackled. "Nurse Ross to the supervisor's office. Nurse Ross to the supervisor's office." By evening shift, something new had appeared on the unit board, posted beside the staffing schedule and the quality metrics. A disciplinary notice. Hospital letterhead. Laminated and professional. Disciplinary notice. Date. Current date. Staff member, Danielle Ross, RN. Incident summary: multiple instances of insubordination, exceeding scope of practice, failure to follow physician orders, and undermining medical authority. Status: formal documentation. Further violations will result in suspension pending termination review. Danielle paused in front of it, her fingers brushing the laminated edge. She read it once, her eyes tracking each word with the methodical attention of someone parsing an intelligence briefing. No tremor in her hands. No heat in her chest. Just information. Data to be filed away. She returned to the commander's room without responding to any of the covert glances from the other staff. His chest rose and fell with the ventilator's rhythm, a mechanical breath that had become more reliable than his own. The monitors beeped their steady song: heart rate, blood pressure, intracranial pressure. The hiss of air escaping from the ventilator circuit. The soft padding of her shoes on linoleum as she approached his bedside. After visiting hours ended, after the sister had left with tear-streaked cheeks and a voice that had stopped believing in hope, Danielle stood alone with her patient. The ICU hummed around her, machines keeping people tethered to a world they might not want to return to. She placed her hand on the commander's arm, careful not to disturb the fall line, careful not to move him in ways that might spike his intracranial pressure. Her jacket hung on the back of the chair, and she reached for it, her fingers finding the inside lining where she'd sewn the patch 16 years ago. A faded square of fabric, the colors worn nearly gray, the unit insignia from her time at Bagram. She'd stitched it there with medical tape and dental floss when she arrived at Seattle General 3 years ago, the only piece of Captain Danielle Ross that had survived the classified operation, the scrubbed records, the official death certificate that had buried her so thoroughly that even her own mother believed the lie. She touched the patch, muscle memory reaching for something real in a world that had been constructed entirely from fiction. "I remember you, Jake," she whispered. The words were barely audible, the kind of words that existed only for the space between them. "Even if you don't remember me." Bagram. 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. "You took that round in the courtyard." "I was there." Angel 6. "I carried you 3 kilometers under fire." "That's where you got the tattoo." "You promised you'd never forget." She looked at his left forearm, at the faded ink. Ross. He'd gotten it done at a forward operating base medical tent, using a needle and ink from a pen, the way Marines did when they wanted to honor something that mattered. She'd seen him do it. She'd tried to talk him out of it, told him it was a mistake, told him their mission was classified beyond acknowledgement, told him their service would be erased. He'd done it anyway. "They're trying to take you from me," she continued, her voice steady as a surgical laser. 20 doctors signed a consensus. 20 of them. All agreeing that you should be disconnected. That your life isn't worth the effort. But they don't know you the way I know you. They don't know that you volunteered for extraction because your squad needed you, that you fought your way back from bleeding out in a poppy field, that everything you've survived has brought you here to this bed in this hospital. She released the patch, released his arm, and stood back. The monitors continued their electronic vigil. Somewhere down the hallway, a code team was being paged. Somewhere else, someone's family was receiving the kind of news that fractured the world into before and after. Danielle pulled out a small notebook from her pocket, the kind nurses used for clinical notes, but this one would be for something else entirely. She began documenting the commander's responses. Pupil reactions to light. The slight twitching of his left hand that the official records dismissed as spinal reflex. The rapid eye movement that suggested consciousness at some level the machines couldn't measure. The details that no one else was looking for because 20 doctors had already decided they didn't matter. What she didn't know was that Dr. Mercer was already in his office, making phone calls. Dr. Mercer sat in his office with the door closed, the afternoon light filtering through blinds that cast him in alternating stripes of shadow and pale yellow. His desk held three things: a telephone with a cord that snaked across mahogany, a notepad filled with precise handwriting, and a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. He didn't touch the coffee. He picked up the phone and dialed from memory. Dr. Patricia Wells answered on the third ring. Her voice carried the weight of someone accustomed to being right. Mercer had studied under her for 4 years at Johns Hopkins. She had written 3 of his recommendation letters. She had called him, once, her finest protégé. "Patricia, it's Marcus." His voice was measured, conversational, the tone of a colleague sharing a difficult observation. "I'm calling about a situation here at Seattle General that I think you should know about. One of our nursing staff has been overstepping significantly. A patient, Commander Morrison, traumatic brain injury, minimal cortical function, has become the focus of what I can only describe as emotional attachment masquerading as clinical judgment." He let the silence breathe. Wells was listening. The nurse in question, Danielle Ross, ICU staff, has been advocating for an experimental protocol that has zero evidence base. When I attempted to redirect her clinical focus toward comfort care and family preparation, she became defensive, resistant to authority. There's a pattern of insubordination, Patricia. The kind that puts patients at risk. He paused. "I thought you should know, given your standards for clinical excellence." Wells asked a question. Mercer answered it with another question, turning her concern into doubt with surgical precision. By the time he hung up 5 minutes later, his former mentor believed she had drawn her own conclusions. He made for more calls. The chief of staff first, a man named Harrison who owed Mercer a favor from a teaching position 3 years ago. Then a board member named Whitmore, a surgeon with financial interests in the hospital's research reputation. Then Dr. Raymond Chen, the medical director of ICU services, whom Mercer had positioned as an ally through 3 months of careful lunches and strategic compliments. The calls followed the same pattern: concern masquerading as collegiality, suggestions framed as observations, doubt delivered as fact. By evening, the phones had rung in reverse. Chen called back first. Then Harrison. By morning, the machinery had begun to move. The formal letter arrived on official hospital letterhead, signed by 20 consulting physicians from various departments and specialties. Cardiology, neurology, internal medicine, trauma surgery, palliative care. 20 names arranged in alphabetical order, each one representing a doctor who had either been persuaded by Mercer's calls or simply agreed to sign a recommendation without asking difficult questions. The letter was technically sound, medically defensible. It recommended immediate discontinuation of the experimental treatment protocol for Commander Morrison, citing insufficient evidence of neurological recovery, resource allocation concerns, and the ethical imperative to transition toward comfort-focused care. The letter was also a cage, and Danielle's wings were inside it. Copies appeared on every bulletin board in the ICU that Tuesday morning. One landed in the nursing director's inbox with a handwritten note from Mercer: "Wanted to make sure you had this for your records. 20 physicians, Patricia. I thought the administration should know where the clinical community stands." The nursing director's name was Patricia as well, though Mercer never acknowledged the coincidence. By Wednesday, the policy came down from Chen's office. All clinical recommendations regarding Commander Morrison's care, made by nursing staff, would require prior written approval from Dr. Mercer's consultation team before implementation. It was framed as quality assurance, standardization of care protocols, ensuring interdepartmental communication. What it was, actually, was a lock on Danielle's hands. She read the policy standing in the hallway outside the commander's room, the paper trembling slightly in her grip. Not from fear. From the effort of restraint. Her jaw tightened to the point where her teeth might have cracked, but her face remained a still lake. A nurse named Sarah walked past and pretended not to see her. Then another. By the time Danielle folded the paper and slipped it into her pocket, she was alone in the corridor. That evening, morning rounds arrived like a delegation from an occupying force. Dr. Mercer led the procession, residents in short white coats, attending physicians in long ones, a cluster of the 20 consulting doctors who had signed the letter, carrying clipboards and expressions of professional gravity. They moved through the ICU with the momentum of institutional authority, stopping at the commander's bedside not to examine him, but to perform an examination for an audience. Dr. Mercer stood at the foot of the bed, his back to the commander's face, addressing the room in the tone of someone delivering a lecture to medical students. Persistent vegetative state, minimal cortical activity, likely no meaningful recovery trajectory given the extent of initial injury. The family should begin considering end-of-life planning. Organ donation may be an option worth discussing. He said this while the commander lay 3 feet away, his eyes sometimes tracking movement, his fingers sometimes curling when Danielle spoke to him. Mercer did not make eye contact with the patient. The patient was not a person in this moment. The patient was a teaching case. Danielle stood at the monitor station, her hands positioned on the edge of the console. She could have stepped forward. Could have cited the neurological improvements documented in the last 72 hours. Could have mentioned the eye-tracking response, the spontaneous hand movements, the reduction in spasticity that suggested cortical reorganization was occurring. She had the data. She had the clinical observations. What she did not have, anymore, was authorization to speak them. One of the consulting doctors, a neurologist from a competing health system, brought in specifically because he had no relationship with Danielle and therefore no reason to question Mercer's narrative, nodded in agreement. The experimental protocol was premature, he said. Lacking proper phase trials. Dr. Mercer smiled the smile of a man watching his plan assemble itself without further input. He turned to leave, the delegation trailing behind him like remoras following a shark, and that was when the monitor alarm began to scream. The oxygen saturation reading dropped like an elevator with a cut cable, 92%, 88, 84. The commander's face flushed red. His respirator continued its mechanical rhythm, but the oxygen being delivered was not reaching his blood. Around the bed, the consulting doctors froze. The residents looked to Mercer. Mercer looked annoyed, as if the patient was being deliberately inconvenient. Danielle saw what was happening before anyone else moved. The commander's neck veins were bulging asymmetrically, more distended on the right side than the left. His trachea, visible under the skin of his throat, had shifted, not subtly, but decisively, 3 centimeters to the right. The clinical picture assembled itself in her mind like a photograph developing in a darkroom, fractured rib from the original trauma, healing with a microfracture, the rib edge puncturing the visceral pleura during a position change or aggressive physical therapy, air leaking into the pleural space, pressure building, tension pneumothorax, the lung collapsing like a balloon that had been slowly stabbed. Her hands were moving before her conscious mind had finished the differential diagnosis. She was at the crash cart, opening the needle decompression kit, her fingers finding the 14-gauge angiocath needle with the certainty of someone who had done this in a forward operating base while mortar rounds shook the building. 80%. 76%. The commander's lips were turning blue. She had the needle positioned over the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, the anatomical landmark where the needle would penetrate the chest wall and enter the pleural space, allowing the trapped air to escape. Her finger was on the plunger. Her hand was steady as a surgical laser. Dr. Mercer's voice cut through the chaos like a scalpel through silk. Nurse Ross, step away from the patient immediately. You are not authorized to perform that procedure. The room went dead silent. She met his eyes. Held them. 3 seconds. 4. His face was triumphant. Waiting. Waiting to see if she would comply and watch the patient die, or commit the act of defiance that would end her career. He had constructed this moment deliberately. She understood that. This was stage 5 of his escalation, active sabotage, the interference with treatment, the moment where institutional power meets human mercy and one of them has to break. She set the needle down. Stepped back. Watched. Mercer moved forward, the authority he had cultivated giving him the space to act as if he knew what he was doing. His hands were shaking slightly, not from fear, but from the tremor that comes from moving without training, without the muscle memory that lives in bones. The 20 consulting doctors crowded closer, their clipboards creating a wall of institutional consensus. The commander's oxygen saturation fell to 72%. 68. The room held its breath. Mercer fumbled with the landmarks, his fingers pressing against the wrong anatomical position, uncertainty flickering across his face. 10 seconds. 15. The commander's complexion darkened like a bruise spreading across water. One of the residents made a small sound, not quite a protest, but not quite compliance either. Danielle moved. She did not run. She did not panic. She stepped forward with the same measured pace she would use walking to morning shift, and she placed her hand on Mercer's shoulder with enough force to move him laterally, not violently, just definitively. He stumbled backward. The residents parted. The consulting doctors gasped. She was no longer asking permission, she was no longer attempting to work within the cage they had built. She positioned the needle between the second and third ribs with the precision of someone who had performed this procedure in a field hospital at FOB Shank while incoming fire rattled the windows. Hand steady. Breathing measured. The skill was so ingrained it did not require thought. She pushed. The hiss of air escaping. The sound of pressure releasing, of survival asserting itself over protocol, of a lung re-expanding like a flower opening toward light. The commander gasped, not the gasp of a man in a vegetative state, but the gasp of a living being receiving oxygen, consciousness flickering across his face like a match striking in the dark. The oxygen saturation climbed, 78%, 82, 88, 94. Normal. Livable. The heart monitor settled into a steady rhythm. The commander's eyes moved, tracking the light, the movement, the face of the woman standing over him. The room remained frozen. Dr. Mercer's face transformed in sequence, shock, then understanding, then red, then white, a portrait of a man watching the mechanism he had built turn against him. One of the consulting doctors whispered something to another. A resident's jaw tightened. Danielle secured the needle with a tape dressing, checked the oxygen saturation one more time, and moved to the monitor to document the procedure with the calm efficiency of someone who had done this countless times. "I'm going on break," she said quietly, not to anyone in particular, just the room in general. "I need some jello." The smallest smile crossed her face, there and gone, a moment of dry wit released like steam from a pressure valve. Her eyes met Mercer's for exactly 1 second. Not defiant. Not triumphant. Just clear. The eyes of someone who understood that she had just crossed from resistance into something else entirely. She walked out of the room. Behind her, the door whispered closed, and in the silence that followed, exactly 20 doctors finally understood who they had been standing next to the entire time. What happened next would change everything. But Danielle did not know that yet. She only knew that the commander was breathing. That her hands had remembered their training. That sometimes mercy and mutiny wore the same face. The oxygen saturation monitor screamed. 74. 72. Commander Morrison's chest heaved against the ventilator, fighting it, and his trachea, she saw it immediately, shifted a half-inch to the left. Tension pneumothorax. Air in the pleural space compressing his lung, collapsing his heart's filling chambers, killing him in real time. Danielle moved before the code team was called. Her hands found the decompression needle from the crash cart, a 14-gauge angiocath, and she positioned herself at his bedside with the muscle memory of someone who'd done this in a field hospital in Loga province under mortar fire, where speed was the difference between a Marine going home and a body going home in a flag-draped box. She didn't hesitate. She didn't tremble. She was already identifying landmarks, second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, when Dr. Mercer's voice cut through the crisis like a scalpel. "Nurse Ross, step away from the patient immediately." She met his eyes. 3 seconds. Long enough for him to see no fear, no doubt, no apology. Then she set the needle on the bedside tray and stepped back, hands at her sides, watching. Mercer approached the bed with the confident stride of a man who'd never performed this procedure outside a simulation. His fingers searched for the landmarks, pressing too deep, missing the anatomical landmarks entirely. The commander's lips turned blue. His oxygen saturation dropped to 68. The monitor beat faster, a panicked rhythm, and Danielle stood motionless while a physician fumbled with a patient's dying body. 20 seconds of silence. That was all it took. Then she moved. Not aggressively. Not with anger. With the terrifying fluid precision of someone who'd made these decisions in places where hesitation meant funerals. She positioned herself beside Mercer, not shoving him, simply stepping in with the inevitability of a door closing, and her hands became the only hands that mattered. The needle found the space between the second and third ribs, the cricothyroid membrane of breathing itself, and she pushed through skin and fascia with the confidence of muscle memory. The hiss of trapped air escaping. The commander's lung re-expanding. Oxygen saturation climbing. 75. 82. 88. Stable. The code team arrived to find the crisis already resolved. The commander gasping, color returning to his face, his sister's hand over her mouth in the observation window. Danielle documented the procedure in his chart with clinical precision, tension pneumothorax identified by tracheal deviation and respiratory distress. Needle decompression performed at 08 for 7 hours after physician delay threatened patient survival. Vital signs stabilized. Breath sounds restored bilaterally. Patient conscious and responsive. She signed it D. Ross, RN, and closed the chart. By noon, Mercer had made 4 phone calls. The chief of staff received the first, patient safety violation. Immediate termination required. The nursing director got the second, assault on a physician. Legal liability nightmare. HR heard version 3, insubordination during a medical emergency. Scope of practice violation. And his college roommate on the hospital board received the final call, the one with the most venom: we need her badge deactivated now before she becomes a lawsuit. Danielle wasn't surprised when the security guards arrived at the ICU at 1,147 hours. 2 of them, their utility belts catching the fluorescent light, and behind them the chief of staff with his arms folded like a judge rendering sentence. She was changing the commanders for line when they appeared. Nurse Ross, we need your badge and facility access card. She finished adjusting the drip rate. Precisely 40 milliliters per hour. Then she turned, unclipped her badge from her scrubs, and held it out. Her hands didn't shake. Her face showed nothing, not defiance, not resignation, not the storm building in her chest like pressure in a locked room. You performed a procedure outside your scope of practice, the chief of staff said. His voice had the quality of someone reading from a script he'd already memorized for liability purposes. You physically interfered with an attending physician. Your employment is terminated effective immediately, and we're reporting you to the state nursing board. The words landed like distant artillery. Professional. Efficient. Designed to strip her of everything she'd built in this hospital over 18 months of exemplary care, perfect charting, and the kind of quiet competence that made patients trust her with their lives. 20 doctors had already signed the letter withdrawing support from the commander's care. 20. She'd seen the list on the nursing director's desk, a coalition of opposition, an institutional vote of no confidence, all because she'd insisted on following the evidence instead of Mercer's ego. Danielle collected her jacket from her locker, the one with the faded unit patch sewn inside the lining, the only piece of her erased life she'd kept. Eagle, globe, an anchor. Medical Battalion insignia. Bagram, 2015. 3 tours of duty. 17 Marines saved under direct enemy fire. A decoration she couldn't acknowledge, couldn't claim, couldn't even admit existed. The walk through the hospital corridor was a gauntlet. Past nurses who wouldn't meet her eyes. Past residents who whispered. Past the ICU where the commander's sister watched through the window, confusion and fear written across her face. Security flanked her like she was a prisoner, not a nurse who'd just saved a life. She'd been ordered to disappear after the operation was classified beyond acknowledgement. Military record scrubbed. Decorated service erased as if Captain Danielle Ross had never worn the uniform, never commanded a field hospital, never held dying Marines while mortar rounds shook the bunker walls. The order had come from a 2-star general with the weight of the Pentagon behind it: new identity. New life. No contact with former units. No acknowledgement of service. And the reason was the kind of secret that could destroy lives, not hers, but his. The boy she'd left behind. Her son. Surfacing now meant breaking that direct order. It meant sacrificing the only thing that had kept him safe for 6 years, her complete and total absence from the life she'd known before. The shadow she'd lived in to protect him. That evening, she sat at the kitchen table in civilian clothes, still in her scrubs underneath, the habit of muscle memory, the need to be ready for crisis that would never come. The tears came without permission, silent and unstoppable, the first time she'd broken composure in public in a decade. 16 years of military training said cry where no one can see it. But she was alone in her kitchen, and the weight of 6 years of silence and erasure had finally found gravity. Her son found her there. 14 years old. The age where boys started noticing things adults thought they were hiding. He'd never seen her cry before. His voice came small and uncertain. "Mom? Why are you home early? You said you had a double shift." She couldn't answer. Couldn't explain about the commander or Bagram or the life buried so deep that digging it up would destroy everything. The silence stretched between them like a wound that wouldn't close, and for the first time in 6 years, she wondered what it would cost if the truth came out. 2 days later, the administrative hearing room at Seattle General smelled like burnt coffee and tension. Danielle sat in the back row, her hands folded in her lap, watching the chief of staff arrange papers that wouldn't matter in about 90 seconds. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like dying insects. She dressed in scrubs instead of civilian clothes, a small defiance, a signal that she was still a nurse even if the hospital had tried to erase her. The doors opened. Her son walked in carrying a shadow box. 14 years old. Thin shoulders. The kind of careful walk that meant he'd rehearsed this moment in the mirror. Inside the glass case sat 4 medals arranged on blue velvet, the one she'd hidden in the attic 6 years ago when her name had been scrubbed from every database except the ones that actually mattered. He placed the box on the hearing table without being asked, his voice shaking like a boy who understood, finally, that his mother was something he couldn't protect anymore. "Mom, they need to see these." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of all the things she'd never told him. All the blood she'd washed out of her hair at night when she thought he was asleep. All the nightmares that had stopped being nightmares and become simple operational memory. She didn't cry. She didn't move. She let the room absorb what her son had just done, let the medals speak for themselves: Navy Cross, Silver Star, Bronze Star, Purple Heart. Medal after medal. Each one a mission. Each one a life saved. Each one a reason she'd disappeared. The chief of staff leaned forward. Dr. Mercer's face went the color of old medical waste. Then the doors opened again and a wheelchair rolled through, pushed by a Marine in dress uniform. Commander Jake Morrison. Awake. Alert. His eyes found Danielle's face across the room and something broke open in his expression, recognition, not of her face, but of something deeper. Something his traumatic brain couldn't access but his body remembered. He stared at her like she'd just walked out of a classified file. "Angel 6, he whispered. The words came out hoarse from 6 weeks of intubation, but everyone heard them. "You were Angel 6. A Marine colonel stepped forward from the waiting area, a man with the kind of presence that made the room's air pressure change. He picked up the shadow box with both hands, the reverent precision of someone handling a flag. He read slowly, letting each word settle like ordnance. The Navy Cross, presented to Captain Danielle Ross, for extraordinary heroism during combat operations at Bagram Airfield, where she provided life-saving medical treatment to 17 wounded Marines under direct enemy fire. During a 47-minute engagement, Captain Ross triaged casualties, established field resuscitation, and coordinated evacuation under sustained mortar fire. Her actions resulted in 17 Marines returning home who otherwise would not have. Dr. Mercer stood abruptly, his chair scraping against tile like a knife dragged across bone. His face had drained of all color. He tried to interject, his voice climbing into registers she'd never heard from him before. This is irrelevant to the protocol violations at issue. A two-star general walked through the doors without knocking. Without announcement. Without the courtesy of asking permission. He was old enough that the rank on his collar seemed earned rather than assigned. He moved past Dr. Mercer without looking at him, which was worse than any acknowledgement could have been, and stood before the shadow box. He rendered a salute. Sharp. Precise. The kind of salute rendered to flags and coffins. Captain Ross was declared killed in action to protect an operation that saved 200 lives. Her records were sealed under my direct order. That seal remains necessary. Her recognition does not. The general turned to face the hearing board, and his eyes passed over Danielle for exactly 3 seconds. Long enough to see her. Long enough to know that she understood what recognition meant, exposure. Her son knew now. This room knew now. And in a few minutes, the rest of the world would know. Someone in the back had been recording on their phone. Danielle had seen the red light. She'd noted it the way she noted everything: exit routes, vital signs, threats. The footage would upload in the next hour. It would hit social media within 4. And by evening, the video, Dr. Mercer sneering "This is irrelevant" while a two-star general rendered a salute to the Navy Cross of a woman the hospital had fired, would reach for million views. The phone in her pocket buzzed. Then again. Then continuously. Dr. Mercer watched the video spread in real time, watched his own face freeze in contempt as the general's hand came up to his forehead, watched the comments accumulate for million views. 10 million. By morning, every major news outlet had picked it up. Decorated combat nurse fired for saving patient. Two-star general condemns hospital's treatment of Captain Danielle Ross. 20 doctors signed petition to abandon traumatic brain injury patient, now she's walking and they're silent. The number 20 appeared again and again. Not just doctors who'd opposed her. 20 specific physicians whose names had been attached to the recommendation to withdraw the experimental treatment protocol. 20 careers suddenly fragile. Dr. Patricia Wells, Mercer's medical school mentor, the woman who'd written his recommendation letter 20 years ago, who'd mentored him through residency, who'd helped him build his reputation, released a statement that afternoon that seemed to echo in the corridors of every hospital on the West Coast. "I am appalled by Dr. Mercer's conduct toward Captain Ross. A woman of her demonstrated competence and service deserves respect, not contempt. The arrogance and cruelty displayed toward a decorated combat veteran reflects a fundamental failure of character. I am personally requesting that the medical board investigate his fitness to practice medicine. I no longer recognize the man I once mentored." The medical board launched a formal investigation within hours. The 20 doctors who'd signed the withdrawal recommendation scrambled to distance themselves, their voices thin in official statements. "We relied on Dr. Mercer's assessments. We weren't aware of recent neurological improvements. Standard protocol based on available data." But 3 of them submitted formal complaints that Mercer had withheld clinical updates: the commander's improving cognition scores, his advancing motor function, the neural responses he'd been demonstrating for 2 weeks. The suppression was deliberate. The documentation was clear. 6 cases opened. 6 patients where Mercer's medical consensus recommendations had led to withdrawn care. 6 families requesting review. 6 potential negligent suits beginning to crystallize. Dr. Mercer's private practice patients began cancelling within days. His hospital privileges at Swedish Medical Center suspended pending review. His privileges at Harborview terminated immediately. They didn't need the board investigation for that decision. The state medical board announced an 18-month license suspension pending ethics review. His malpractice insurance premiums tripled. His wife filed for separation. He sat in his emptying office, watching the viral video loop on his phone, his own face frozen in contempt as the general saluted, and realized he'd destroyed his career targeting the one person in the hospital who'd actually earned her authority. She'd just chosen to claim it. 6 months later, Danielle stood in the parking lot of Seattle General at 6:02 a.m., watching Dr. Mercer load medical supplies into a van marked Temp Staff Medical Services. The only work that would hire him during his license suspension. His hands moved like a man operating underwater, each box an apology he'd never make. He saw her watching. He didn't meet her eyes. He loaded another box. Inside the hospital, Commander Morrison walked the ICU hallway with only a slight limp. Rehabilitation had restored most of his motor control, and the neurological improvement had exceeded every projection their experimental protocol had promised. He showed anyone who'd listened the tattoo on his forearm. This is Captain Ross. She carried me 3 clicks under fire after an IED took out our convoy. I couldn't remember her face, but my body remembered her name. Danielle had been reinstated as ICU clinical nurse specialist with a formal apology from the chief of staff and back pay for the month she'd been fired. Exactly 20 doctors, the same ones who'd signed the withdrawal recommendation, now sought her clinical input on their most complex traumatic brain injury cases. Her experimental neural stimulation protocol was now standard treatment. 3 peer-reviewed papers had been published on her methodology. She was invited to speak at trauma conferences. Universities wanted her as a consultant. None of it mattered as much as watching Commander Morrison walk without assistance. Her son kept the shadow box in his room now. Not hidden. Displayed on the shelf beside his textbooks and model airplanes. He told his friends, with the kind of careful pride that suggested he understood what silence cost. My mom was military medical. That's why she knew what to do. Just facts. No secrets necessary anymore. The faded unit patch was still sewn inside her jacket lining, where it had been for 6 years. She touched it at the start of every shift, not a ritual, but an acknowledgement. A reminder that she was still the same person who'd patched wounds under mortar fire. That the uniform had come off but the responsibility hadn't. Commander Morrison found her in the parking lot as she reached her car. He moved with the easy confidence of someone who'd reclaimed his body. His eyes held hers with the clarity that the experimental protocol had restored. Angel 6, you saved me twice. Once in Bagram. Once here. Why? She considered the question, watching the medical supply van disappear around the corner. Watching Mercer's career dissolve into temp agency work. Watching the 20 doctors scramble to build back what they'd tried to destroy. True heroism is what you do when the world stops watching. The commander nodded. They walked back inside together, past the unit board where her disciplinary notice used to hang. A new commendation hung there now, ICU clinical nurse specialist, exemplary service, commendation for heroism in patient care. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The ventilators wheezed their mechanical rhythms. Somewhere down the corridor, another patient was fighting back from the edge. Danielle returned to work, her hand steady, her composure intact, her hidden identity no longer hidden. The rest of the world had finally caught up to what she'd always known. She was exactly where she belonged. If someone you trust tried to destroy you and failed, how would you handle what comes next? Subscribe, leave a comment, and tell us your thoughts. And if you know a hero in scrubs, tag them, because not all warriors wear camo. Some wear stethoscopes.